Hi, good evening, everyone, and thank you for this generous opportunity and also for a very kind introduction. Without wasting any more time, I would start my presentation. So, as already mentioned by Farooq sir, we'll be talking about the Bene Israeli community today. I belong to the Bene Israeli community, born and brought up, and practicing Bene Israeli. So, um, what I know from the very beginning is what I've already experienced. So my understanding of the community, my understanding of our culture, of our heritage comes from me literally practicing it and experiencing it. It was only with a few years back that I actually got into researching it with proper research techniques, you may say, and looking at the community not just from the perspective of being a member, but also from a perspective of being a researcher, being a heritage professional, and also putting it forward in a way that takes it beyond its history. So we have so much information available. It's a very well documented community. I'll put it forward. You will have the history, the heritage of the community very well documented. What you have today is also taking it a step further into a glimpse into the culture of the community, taking it beyond what you would generally read in the magazines or the newspapers, that would publish about the Jewish New Year, where you will show someone's blowing a shofar, or talking about the very general aspects of the community like and ceremonies, which have become very popular over the years. But before we get into all of that, let's start from the beginning. Let's start from understanding who are the Bene Israeli. So the Bene Israeli are nothing but a Jewish diaspora. They're a group of people who adhere to Judaism as a religion. And the word Bene Israeli literally translates to children of Israel. So Benin is children and Israel is well, Israel. Okay, so as I was saying, the Bene Israelis literally translate to children of Israel, and they belong to a set of a subset of the Jews known as the Sephardic Jews. Now, if you look at traditionally and historically, the Jews are divided into two main subsets called the Ashkenazi Jews and the Sephardic Jews. So the Ashkenazi Jews are basically the Jews that moved to France, South Germany, and from there they spread out to the Western Europe and later to America. The Sephardic Jews, on the other hand, are someone who settled down somewhere in Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, and later moved on to Eastern Europe, Asia, Africa, and some part of Russia, Soviet Union, those kind of places. So the Jews that you have in India are Sephardic Jews, including the Bene Israelis. And the understanding, the history goes that they have come here more than 2,000 years ago. Um, as a legend, as a historical theory, they're also considered to be one of the lost 10 tribes of Israel. So there is a beautiful theory around the Jews, which says that there are 12 tribes of Israel, of which the 10 tribes dispersed during the attacks and the collapse of the empire with the collapse of the Jewish temple. And these 10 tribes dispersed off to different places with traces unknown. So it is believed that over the years, one of the tribes reached the shores of India, and today the Bene Israelis are considered to be one of the lost 10 tribes. Mm, just like the so what are so just like they are children of Israel, there is a certain identity of being Jewish. There are a lot of theories as to when they came. Now I'm using the term theory because there are various conjectures and assumptions which are based on certain facts, certain contexts, and a certain understanding of the environment in which they come from and the way they've settled down. So, based on their practices, the community's practices, the community's way of following religion, the practice of festivals, and the festivals that they didn't practice and did practice, there are a lot of conjectures and theories built around it as to when they would have come to India. And there are various different timelines, there are various different regions. So I've put down some of the popular ones over here and some of the most accepted ones as well. So one of the idea is that they would have either come from somewhere in Yemen, so they would have traveled from the Holy Land, come down south to Yemen, and from there they would have come to India. There are other theories as well which talk about a different timeline. Some say that they would have reached India somewhere in the 6th century AD. But this is more of a theory which came up with the British, and came up with a far later understanding and reveal of the community. The other popular and well accepted understanding of the theories go that they would have come somewhere before the destruction of the first temple, or or before the construction of the second temple. And this is based on the kind of practices that the communities have today. So we will be looking through some of the practices of the community, and based on that, you will realize how this theory would have come to be in the first place. The most commonly accepted understanding is that they would have come somewhere in the 2nd century BC, and they would have come via sea route and settled somewhere in the western coast of India, um, out of a shipwreck. And this is exactly what our oral history says. So just like all different communities, different natives and cultures, even the Bene Israelis have their own oral history and folklore. According to this oral history, the community believes that a ship crashed on the western coast of India, that is Konkan Strip, around 2000 years ago, more than 2000 or 2200 years ago. And this ship came somewhere perhaps from northern Palestine to avoid persecution at that point. And it is believed there were about 40 men and women on the ship. And out of these 40 men and 40 women who were on the ship, only 7 couples are said to have survived. And these 7 couples are believed to be the ancestors of the present-day Bene Israeli community. Now, of course, that's why it is a part of folklore and a legend if you look at it. It's only a miracle that could mean that 7 men and 7 women, that two couple, surviving a shipwreck and becoming ancestors of a community today. So it is said that the ship crashed somewhere near Naugao, and what you have today as a physical remnant or a tangible aspect of that heritage is the Naugao cemetery, which is maintained today by the community to a certain extent. And what you see over here in the image are these round shaped boulders put out in the shape of a burial practice or a burial system. And this is what is believed to the oldest cemetery or the oldest burials where the men and women who died on that shipwreck were buried. The rest of the people, the surviving 7 couples, came to the shores, and it is believed that they were rescued by the local communities. And from then on, the story continues. The oral history is something that is passed on from generation to generation. It is something which is taught to us. We visit these sites. It's kind of like a local pilgrimage, and that is how we truly connect to those places as a community. But apart from that, we also have a lot of tangible aspects. We have rituals and practices that connect us to these spaces and this history, and they interconnect with a lot of interconnect us to a lot of the Jewish diaspora around as well. So it is believed that when they reached the coast and there was a shipwreck, they lost everything. They lost their religious prayer books, they lost their belongings, and whatever they would have been carrying with them. And they reached the coast hungry and famished. It is believed that the local communities of Koi, Agris, and Kunbis gave them food and shelter. So those are the local communities that lived on this western coast, and they are the ones who received these strangers from foreign land and give them home and shelter. There is an understanding with the community that the first food that the Bani Israelis ate when they reached this land and or were they offered was the local binda or kadwe wal, and this is the first food that they ate after the long journey and the long trauma that they went through. Even today, if you the local community, the Bani Israeli community, commemorates this day in a form of a Birdatza Rosa, which translates to the fast of bidda, the bitter field beans, and it's observed in a form of a typical ceremony called as thada bharne. So if you look to this image over here, where you see a plate full of different ingredients, one of the things that you will see is the bidda curry. It's served with the puris, which is made with jaggery. So it's a combination of the bitter field beans and it's a combination of the sweet puri that goes with it, along with some raw bidda as well, some eggs, rice, chicken. You have certain fruits, especially dates and bananas, and you have the leaves of sabja kept on the side. So this is a very traditional Bene Israeli ritual that follows Birdas or Rosa. So for the whole day, they keep a fast, and they break the fast by eating bidda and remembering the people who died on the shipwreck. Now, interestingly, this festival of or this observance of Bidat Rosa falls on the same day as Tisha B'Av, which is the Jewish day commemorating the destruction of the first and the second Jewish holy temple. So there is also an understanding with the community, as and when the community started getting educated and there was a religious revival eventually, that they realized that perhaps they are not only commemorating the death or observing the death of the fellow community members on the ship, but they're also somewhere observing the keeping of fast, the destruction of the first and the second temple, and perhaps various other destructions that happened throughout the history of the Jewish people. Mm, Interestingly, across the Jewish diaspora, you will find people having a solemn meal of sprouts or lentils or something else before keeping the fast, and you will see that reflected in the Bidat Rosa as well. So there is a diasporic connection, there is a local tradition, and there is also a history and association with this kind of a practice. And you will find multiple of these practices throughout the Bene Israeli history and present generation as well. So, as I said, they lost everything. They lost their religious books. They would have forgotten most of their practices. But there were a certain things that they very well remembered and they practiced and passed on to the future generations. Some of the key practices that are passed on and are remembered were the prayer of Shema Israel. So it is a short prayer that is recited by the Jews across the diaspora, and this prayer is something which they remember. The other aspect is of keeping the practice of kosher. So kosher relates to the dietary laws of the Jews, and it talks about the keeping of a kosher kitchen. It talks about the kosher agricultural practices, kosher laws for food, meat, so on and so forth. So we'll be discussing kosher in little more detail a little later. But this was a practice which this community which reached the coast was familiar with, and they remembered. They also remembered observing the day of Shabbat. So keeping the day of Shabbat, that is the day of Saturday, as holy, and keeping it a day of rest. And also the circumcision of the male child. So on the eighth day of when a male child is born, the male child is circumcised. So this was a practice which they remembered and continued forward. On the other hand, they also adopted a lot of local things and local cultural practices in their own. So they adopted Marathi as their own language. They took up local clothing, and they also took up a certain aspects of the local culture into their own sphere of religious practices. So if you look at the old photographs or old descriptions of the Bene Israeli women, you would understand that they wore nawari saris. They wore the heavy typical jewelry that comes from the region. The men wore the local clothing style. They wore a long kurta or a dhotar and those kind of things. And even today, you will still see the practice of wearing the green bangles by married women and the Mangal Sutra. So though it is kind of diminishing today in the present community, but it is something which is still practiced. It is something which still holds great amount of importance in the community. At the same time, they also remembered a lot of their Jewish festivals and practiced them in the local context and Marathi name. Now, what does this mean? So basically, there are a list of Jewish festivals. Um, they remembered these Jewish festivals. They understood what these Jewish festivals were, but because they didn't have any religious books, they didn't have the temple to worship, go in and worship or conduct sacrifices in. They were not able to practice these festivals in its complete form. Also, eventually over the years, they gave Marathi names to these festivals. So, for example, the Jewish New Year or Rosh Hashanah became Navetze San, or or Purim, the festival of Queen Esther, which falls on the same day as Holi, became Holica's son. Or Passover or Pesach becomes Anashi Dhakacha's son, and so on and so forth. So a lot of these Jewish festivals took on Marathi names. This is something which was found a few years ago. This is an illustration from a book called Puna Haggadah, which was written somewhere in the 1870s and which was recently discovered in UK. So it became quite a news in the Jewish circle and scholars and researchers front when this book was discovered. And if you see over here, it talks about a practice of making matzah during the festival of Passover. So I found this very interesting back then, and I found it even interesting today that there was a particular way in which you make this typical flatbread for the festival of Passover. We'll talk about this festival in little detail, but I just wanted to emphasize on the fact that the dressing of these people in this particular image. So you'll see women wearing saris, having jewelry like nut and earrings and long necklaces. Um, and they're wearing in a sort of Nawari saris. They have anklets in their feet, and they're doing a very traditional ritual. Now, if you look at the practice of making matzah today, let's say even in Israel or other places, uh, if someone makes these handmade beautiful matzahs, they are referred to as artisanal matzahs and artisanal flatbreads. And this is something which the community practiced back then and practices even today. It also shows the involvement of the community coming together during festivals and celebrating the festivals together. The community, while they settled on the western coast, they decided to take up the local profession and assimilate themselves in the local society. So the primary profession that the community took up was that of oil pressing, and they observed. And as I mentioned earlier, they observed the day of Shabbat, that is Saturday, as off, and that is why the community came to be known as Shanivar Teli, and that is the name that the community had for the longest time. So the community was not known as Bene Israeli; they were known as Shanivar Teli or just Teli. So even today, if you go to some of these villages and you speak to some of the older people, they will also identify these community as Shanwar Telis, and the Teli houses. They will point you out towards some, perhaps a house in Akshi or some other village, and to tell you, yes, this is where some of them lived till before they migrated to Israel. Mm, so that is what it is. So they took a day of Shabbat or Saturday off, and they were really well-known Telis or oil pressers in throughout the villages. So the spread of the Bene Israelis or the Shanivar Telis across the western coast is in the entire district of Raigad. You will find them spreading across different villages in the neighborhood, from Alibag, Akshi, Reodanda, Borlai, Korlai, and so on and so forth. So multiple villages became home to these Shanivar Telis. In fact, there are also records where a certain Teli moved out, or either to Mumbai, or moved out and migrated to Israel. They would invite a Teli from another village, a Shanivar Teli from another village, to come and set up his oil pressing unit in the village, or continue with that oil pressing unit that was there. So that was the importance of these Telis in all of these villages. Apart from oil pressing, they also took up various other professions. Some of the common and prominent ones is that of agriculture and carpentry and animal husbandry. Traces of these things you will find even today in the community. So, for example, the Vaskar family is perhaps the only one today who even today continues the profession of being a Teli, and are even today referred to as Shanwar Telis. A lot of the Bene Israelis or the Teli even today have farmlands, though they may not be practicing it. They still hire people to work on it. Animal husbandry is seen in different forms even today. with different communities. So, for example, a lot of people who even today stay in some of these villages or have open spaces have been known to be taming hens and chickens, and those are the ones that they would take care. So they'll have a small poultry for themselves, and they would use that same chicken for their own consumption as well. So these are some things that continue. There are very interesting and unique example of carpentry work of the community. We'll talk about it in a bit when we talk about the synagogues as well. So, till about 1600s, this was the general scenario of the Bene Israeli or the Teli community. They worked as Telis and farmers. They celebrated their observed their festivals. Interestingly, of all the festivals, there are a certain fasts and a certain observances that they never practiced because they didn't know about them. So, for example, the festival of Hanukkah that falls somewhere in December is an 8-day festival of lights, and this festival commemorates the building of the second Jewish temple. Now, before the phase of the religious revival in the 17th and the 18th century, the Teli or the Bene Israeli community didn't know about Hanukkah. There are no records of Hanukkah being celebrated or practiced. The same way, the festivals related to the destruction of the second temple, or observances, not festivals, but observances related to the destruction of the second temple are also not practiced. And based on these assumptions or these conjectures, one understands that this community would have sailed from the Holy Land way before the construction of the second Holy Temple, and that is why the timeline talks about more than 2,200 years. Um, Now, a major credit for the religious revival of the Bene Israeli community or the Shanivar Telis goes to a person by the name of David Rahabi. Now, there are no clear records about this particular person. He is believed to be a religious scholar or a rabbi, and there are various theories as to who he would have been or where he would have come from. One of the common theories is that he would have either worked with the Dutch East India Company, or he could have been a Malabar Jew who lived between 1694 and 1772. And he came and because he was a merchant, he's believed to be a merchant. He would have traveled up north, and he would have recognized this particular community, and that is how he would have taken interest. There is an interesting theory or a story that goes in the community that says that um, he saw this community during his travels, and he realized that the women of the community while making food and while preparing their ingredients, were choosing them were being very selective about it. He realized that while picking out fish, they were only picking out fish that was considered kosher or clean by the Jewish laws, and letting go of all other seafood. And he found this practice very intriguing and very curious. So when he tried interviewing and talking with these people, he realized that they are perhaps a sect of the Jewish diaspora who would have reached way long back and lived on this coast for a very long time. So when he identified them to be Jews, he selected three young men from the families of Jiratkar, Shapurkar, and Rajpurkar, and taught them to read and write in Hebrew. Interestingly, without teaching them the translation or meaning of it. So he just taught them how to read the prayer books and how to read the prayers. It is also believed that he tried to introduce the new festivals that they didn't know, like, for example, Hanukkah or the fasts and the feasts that they were not familiar with. So, so he kind of is credited with the religious revival of the community. But he was not the only one. A lot of religious revival also happened because of the British who were setting up the East India Company in Bombay, and also because of the Christian missionaries that came with the Portuguese and others who came to India. Um, Now, there would some would say that there is a conflict of why would the Christian missionaries who are all out for conversion would help this community regain their identity as being Jews. And there are very interesting theories and records as well around it, which talks about them teaching them about the Old Testament, that is the first part of the Bible, we hope that they could get them to the second half as well. But as I mentioned earlier, the community was well versed with the practices of their community, though they didn't have their religious texts and books. They knew what were their festivals. They understood their practices. They understood Shabbat, and that is why when the Christian missionaries taught them about the Old Testament, they received it well, but didn't study or learn beyond it. There are very few records of perhaps a very few families who took up to Christianity, but there are no elaborate records for me to emphasize on. Um, uh, the identity of this community was also reinforced with the help of education as well. So, with the coming of the British, with the setting up of the British system, the schools came into being, and and Venezuelan children, both men and women, took up education from an early age and were encouraged to join these schools. So when they started educated and started learning is when they realized that they could actually study their own religion better and were able to translate it from Hebrew to Marathi for the rest of the community as well, who spoke Marathi even if they couldn't read it. So that was a huge impact of education and a religious revival on the community. Um, Now, of course, there was because this community started gaining education and started educating themselves in the local language, reading and writing, and there was an increase in the rate of literacy. It became very easy for the community to move out from these villages and find better jobs with Bombay. So, with the establishment of Bombay as the center of the British East India Company, um, a lot of these Bene Israelis or these Shanivar Telis were invited to settle down. um, and and they were given jobs with the local offices of the British and other sectors. So they took up local professions in the city, where some of them continued what they were doing, and others took up jobs with the East India Company, either as clerks or part of the British Army. Um, Before I come to this as well, the British Army, the the Bene Israelis or the Shanivar Telis were for the very long time also part of the Maratha army and also part of Angrez navy as well. So there are records of the Bene Israelis or the Shanivar Telis being part of the of Kanoji Angrez force, and a lot of them were given very good positions and also were given good land and also titles. So the men from the families of especially of Sarikar, Morekar, Vadhavkar, so they took up great positions with with Angrez army and force, and reached a great prosperous height during his time period. Um, with the British, I think it's also the same thing that happened, that they moved with the coming in of British from Maratha to the British Army and joined the army as well. Apart from the army and clerical positions, also took up different jobs and professions like working in the film industry, working as educators, because again they were educated and were very keen on learning further. They took up positions in hospitals as nurses and doctors as well. So there are a large number of people, Bene Israelis and Shanwar Telis, who took up professions, um, ex, trained professions as well. It is only with them coming to Bombay that and working with the British that they started taking up these surnames, these unique Bene Israeli surnames by the name of Kerr. So all your surnames of the Bene Israeli community come from the villages that they come from. So, for example, my surname Pezarkar comes from the village called Pezari, and there are various others. So, Akshikars come from Akshi, Korlekar comes from Korle, and so forth. Mm, and they were basically a requirement while filling out in the British documentation process, that they had a requirement of a surname, and that's where this community, when they moved to Bombay, is perhaps for the first time have a record of showing up a surname. Now, when they came to Bombay, you they settled as a community. So by the 1740s, when you have the first of the community move in, they settled in a region called as the Israel Mohalla. And this region is basically in Khadak area of South Bombay. It's as you can read up top, it says Masjid Bandar. And this area became Israel Mohalla because as and when the members started coming in from different villages, they started taking up houses next to each other in one neighborhood. And that particular neighborhood eventually ended up being known as Israel Mohalla because so many of them started setting up over there. Now, when such a huge community was starting to move in over there, it was only obvious that with religious revival, with an understanding and a new awakened realization of their religion and a space for themselves, it was only obvious that the first synagogue was soon built. So by 1796, the first Bene Israeli synagogue was established in Bombay, and it was established by a person called as Samuel Ezekiel Devekar. There is a very interesting story to it as well, like a background. And it is believed that he was not believed, there are records actually to it, that he was a soldier in the British Army and he fought Tipu Sultan in the Second Anglo-Mysore War. Now, lot of these army men, including Divekar and some other Bene Israelis, were captured during the war, and they were given an option of either converting to Islam or being executed. It is said that Divekar and his other Jewish companions accepted death as a penalty, but refused to convert to Islam. And when his turn came to be executed, he raised his hand and he said the Jewish prayer of Shema Israel. When Tipu Sultan, it is said, believed that now this is where you have the history flowing into mythology or narrations, where that Tipu Sultan asked him, "What religion do you belong to?" And Samuel Ezekiel Divekar, said that I am a Bene Israeli. And his Tipu Sultan's mother heard this and she said to Tipu Sultan that we cannot kill him, we cannot execute him. He is a fellow brethren and maybe we should give him, we should let him live. So when he lived, it is said that he came back and he thought of building this synagogue and named it Gate of Mercy for the mercy that was shown to him by Lord when he was captured, and that's how it was named. On a very recorded note, it is also said that Samuel Devekar came from a very well-off, wealthy family of Bene Israelis, and he always had an intention of building a synagogue since he first saw one in the Kochi during one of his campaigns in siege with the British Empire. And that wish or the desire to build a synagogue only strengthened after he was let go by Tipu Sultan. So that becomes more logical or more valid. Now, this synagogue is very close to the Israeli Mohalla, that is near Masjid Bandar, and the name Masjid Bandar itself comes from this synagogue. So when the Masjid Bandar railway station was built, the station was named after the first Bene Israeli synagogue, that is this Gate of Mercy synagogue, and that's how it gains its name. So, contrary to popular belief about it being named after the mosque that are in the area, it's actually named after the synagogue. Eventually, of course, there were multiple other synagogues built, and not just in Bombay and Thane, but also back in the villages where a large number of people were still living for the longest time period. So this is the list of the Bene Israeli synagogues. So I couldn't fit in all the names, so I decided I'll mark them. So all these small points that you see in blue is where you have the Bene Israeli synagogues. There is one in Pune, there is one in Ahmedabad, but these are the ones. In total, if you look at in India, you have more than 32 synagogues in the country, and they belong to both all the Bene Israelis, the Baghdadis, the Cochin Jews, the Pradeshi Jews, and also the Mizoram Jews, which are there in up northeast. And so there are more than 33 synagogues in the country, of which about I think 18 or 20 of them are Bene Israeli synagogues. Um, and these are only a few examples that I've put on. So Magin Abbot in Alibag, Bethel in Revdonda, and Magin Abraham in Ahmedabad. There are about 8 synagogues and prayer halls in Mumbai. There is a synagogue in Thane when the community started moving. So as and when the community moved, either for trade or other purposes, they started erecting their own synagogues in those places. And these synagogues are not to be mistaken for temples, because there are no Jewish temples today. A synagogue is a place of a congregation. So what do we have? So this is a typical layout or an insides of a synagogue. What you have here is you have the main center stage in between, which is known as a teba. And from this teba, you have the prayers being read. So the main cantor or the priest would stand on this teba, and he would face for the front, and he would read his prayers. The marriages, a traditional Bene Israeli marriage, would also be conducted on the teba with a cloth on top of it, covering it as a roof. Okay. You have the sitting arrangement on the sides, so people can sit in all directions, and you have right in the front, you have a place where there are where the holy books or the Sefer Torahs are kept. So these are the key aspects of a synagogue. So when you enter a synagogue, on the right hand side doorpost, you will find the mezuzah. Mezuzah is basically a small case which has a scroll with a prayer inside. It's basically a blessing for a space. So it's not just the synagogue, but every Jewish household across the world, every Jewish diaspora will have a mezuzah on the door, and that is a sign of being a Jewish space. You'll have the Sefer Torahs, which would be kept in something like this. So if you see over here, there's like a cupboard. So you will have the Sefer Torahs kept here. Then there is something called as a Ner Tamid, or the eternal light. So this light keeps burning throughout. So it's a 24-hour light which will be burned, and the caretaker would make sure that this light keeps burning. And you have the chairs of Prophet Elijah. So Prophet Elijah is considered to be a very important prophet, not just in the Bene Israeli community, but also across the Jewish diaspora. And a chair is reserved for Prophet Elijah to make sure that he blesses the congregation. There is an interesting aspect as well, which is the ladies section. So in an Orthodox Bene Israeli synagogue, and I'm using the word Orthodox and not traditional, because the Orthodox synagogues have this traditional arrangement for a separate ladies section or a ladies gallery. And that is how you determine or you know that the synagogue is Orthodox. Sephardic synagogue will have a teba in between, that is the center stage in between, whereas the Ashkenazi synagogues may have it like a pew at the end of it, which resembles more of the Christian churches. Not many differences there in the synagogue, but you can still identify nuances if you study the synagogues better. As I mentioned earlier, the Beni Israeli surnames come from the different villages that they come from, and they became compulsory because of the British documentation. And interestingly, over the time period, it was not just about documentation, but it ended up becoming a part of a Jewish identity or the Beni Israeli identity. So, for the longest time, and even today, a Beni Israeli family is easily identified as to which family a person belongs to based on the surname. There is a very interesting or typical way of asking, "Tuza कर कुठला?" in Marathi, like, or what is your family surname? What कर are you? Because all Bene Israeli surnames, barring one or two, have a कर at the end of it. So I'm a Pezarkar. It comes from Pezari village. So there are Kurulkar, there are Akshikar, there is Pendkar, there is Talkar, and they all are the names which come from the local villages that are settled in. Over the time period, there are many families which have given up on their surname for various reasons. Some for professional reasons, for moving out of India and finding their surnames very difficult to pronounce, or so on and so forth. But today, the surnames have become more than just a reminder of their village. It is an integral part of being associated to a certain family in the community. And because it is a very small minority community with hardly let's say 4,000 living in in India today, it just becomes very easy to know a person from its surname. So that is how tiny the community is today. An important part of the identity, while we are talking about it, is also about the Bene Israeli food. The Bene Israeli food today has a lot of its influence and its inspiration from the local ingredients and local cooking practices of the Konkan coast and where they come from. Unfortunately, the community has no memory or no record of the kind of food that they consumed from where they came from to India. So the only understanding of the Bene Israeli food today comes from the local culture and local community. The food is simple, but is a marriage between the local culture and religion. And I say this because though it is made with local ingredients, it has local flavors, it has a local cultural influences. There is a religious aspect to it. There is religious association to most of its food, and food has become part of many of the religious and cultural practices and ceremonies as well. Um, the unique aspect of the Bene Israeli cuisine that puts it apart from all the other coastal communities, its adherence to the laws of kosher and kosher practices. So, what is kosher? So, kosher is a Hebrew word for fit or appropriate and describes the food that is suitable for a Jew to eat. So it is something which is mentioned in the Old Testament, but the nuances of it has been developed in the biblical times and developed by the rabbis or the latest scholars who came up. So according to the concept of kosher, you can eat only a certain kind of animals and fish and fowls. So for example, any animal that has a split hoof and chews its own cud is considered to be kosher. So your goat and sheep, lamb is considered kosher. On the other hand, your wild animals are not considered kosher. Same goes for the fish as well. So any fish that has fins and scale is considered kosher. Otherwise it's not kosher. So something like your prawns and shrimps and lobster is a non-kosher fish. So when we talked about David Rahabi identifying these Eli women, differentiating the clean kosher and the non-kosher fish, this is what it meant. So she was basically separating the shellfishes from the scales and bone fishes. It's also the kosher practice goes beyond in the practice of how the meal is prepared. So a very key criteria is that meat and milk cannot be mixed together. So something like, for example, a butter chicken becomes a no-no in the Jewish laws. Um, there is a practice of how the meat is slaughtered or how the meat is cut and cleaned. It is very important in the laws of kosher that you drain it of all its blood, and blood is not considered kosher, of even if the animal is kosher. Kosher beyond this also goes beyond to how a farmland is. So even a farmland can be kosher. So just like there is Shabbat for us, for people, like the seventh day is the day of rest, that is Saturday. The even the farmland follows a 7 year cycle where the seventh year is the day of rest and you don't grow anything on a piece of land for the seventh year. So that's how you maintain the shmita or the kosher of the land. um, Kosher kitchen and utensils is basically keeping separate utensils for your dairy products, separate utensils for your meat products and fish products, and so on and so forth. The Bene Israelis have been practicing kosher slaughter. There are people who are trained in this process. They follow the cooking and the consumption of meat and maintaining of the kosher kitchen as well. Um, Now, as I said, that we have a lot of traditional cuisines which became our identity, and you'll see that because the community adheres to the laws of kosher, they found their own ways of making things work. So, for example, if we can't mix milk and meat together, the substitute is that we use coconut milk. So instead of your kadhi, which is made with either tak, buttermilk, or dahi, you would have a coconut milk kadhi that is prepared in Venezuelan households. Coconut milk is very prominently seen in almost all kind of sweets because it may be followed with a meat preparation or a fish preparation or so on and so forth. There is a heavy use of sprouts and legumes and select vegetables that are prepared. The Bene Israelis, just like all other communities like Koris and Kunbis and the East Indians, even the Bene Israelis have their own unique set of masalas. Now, there is no specific name for these masalas, but these masalas taste slightly different, and you can easily recognize a Bene Israeli preparation from the other Konkan or the coastal cuisine preparations as well. Feasts and festivities are also an important part. So, like we talked about the Passover bread in or the matzah in the earlier one, it's a very traditional preparation. It's something which is practiced by the Jewish diaspora all over the world. What Bene Israelis do unique is they also prepare, along with the matzah from the wheat matzah, they also prepare rice bhakris. So instead of having wheat bhakris on Passover, for the 7 days of the Passover, they would eat rice bhakris. And all the preparation that are there around Passover is made with fresh spices. So they would avoid using dry spices during that time period. Um, Purim is celebrated with Puran Puri. So this is something which they have taken from the local communities and local things. So as I said, Purim falls on the same day as Holi and was known as Holi Sasan. A lot of Maharashtrian families prepare Puran Puri for Holi, and perhaps the Bene Israelis took up this similar practice. Rosh Hashanah or the New Year, the Jewish New Year, has the traditional halwa preparation, which is the Bene Israeli halwa. And then there's also the sweets like karanji, sandan, gharya, which come from the local communities with a touch of the Bene Israelis and their own preparation. So these are some of the images. So you have on top, you have the karanjis, which are made with coconut filling. You have the kiddush, which is made for the Shabbat. So it's basically grape juice, which is freshly extracted. You have the sandan, which is a very popular coastal delicacy. It's consumed by many coastal communities like the Konkani Muslims and Kois as well. And you have the preparation of the Bene Israeli halwa, which is slightly unique to the community. Apart from the food practices and surnames and other things, there are also Bene Israeli customs which are unique. So, like we talked about the birdaza rosa or the specific dish for which is thai, which is made for the birdaza rosa. A similar kind of offerings are made throughout the year for a couple of other days or observances as well. So there is something called as a Malmacha Rosa, which is and there is Khiritza Rosa, and these are all fasts which are kept before for the whole day, and the fast is broken with the keeping of this particular dish offering. Over here, what you see in the image is a Khiritza Thar, which is made on the day of Khiritza Rosa. Now, Khiritza Rosa is observed according to the Jewish calendar on a day which is a fast in the Jewish diaspora. But the Bene Israeli community observes this as a harvest festival. So a Khiritza Rosa is made with the first rice stalk that is harvested traditionally, and a kheer is made and is offered with a mix of 5 vegetables. So that's a mix of panchabhajis, and you will have obviously rice, fruits, and other things going with it. So because this is a harvest festival, it talks about the Bene Israelis also being an agricultural community. The Malida ceremony. Now, this is something which is, again, many of you would have heard of this. A lot of Bene Israelis are today associated or identified because of their Malida ceremony. It is a unique ceremony, a unique cultural practice which is practiced by the community. It is an offering which is done to Prophet Elijah. So, as I mentioned, like in synagogue, there is a chair reserved for Prophet Elijah. The Bene Israelis have a very strong affiliation with Prophet Elijah, and that is seen in the way the Malida ceremony is conducted along with the prayers for him. So you have this entire Malida thar being made, which is made with rice flakes, that is poha, along with dry fruits, coconut, sugar, and plated along with a number of fresh fruits as well. There are different understandings as to the term Malida and the practice and where it comes from. Malida as a term is being used by different communities. Again, it's something, a term you'll find in the Parsis, you'll find in the Konkani Muslims as well. And it comes with a term which comes meaning that it's a mixture of different things coming together. Miraune. So that is where Malida comes. But there are different assumptions and understandings that perhaps it takes its inspiration from the Hindu custom of giving an offering or a naivedya, or it may also be something which which may be a Muslim practices are on their peers, dargahs or urus and those kind of things. So Prophet Elijah, as I said, so apart from his Malida, the Prophet Elijah, also referred to as Eliyahu Hanavi, has a very strong understanding in the community as well. Um, there is a local belief that Prophet Elijah um, came to India and in a village called Saga, and he looked over the Bene Israeli community, that his diaspora over here, and he left from a chariot over there. So there is this place called as Elijah's Rock, or Tap. Ellev Hanabi se Tap in Marathi, what is that? It is there in Saga village, and you will see the marking, and you will find lot of Bene Israelis coming, even from Israel, will come over here and pay a visit to this site. So, so there is a very strong association and a very strong affiliation with Prophet Elijah, which you will not find with other Jewish diasporas around the world. Apart from this, so I'll take another 5 minutes more. I know it's already past 7 or somewhere close to 7. Um, the community has a lot of its customs, as I said earlier. It takes a lot of its custom from the local communities as well. So though our religious practices are very much Jewish, and the community adheres to a lot of its practices and sticks to Judaism as its base, a lot of cultural practices around it are taken from the other neighboring communities as well. So you will have the mehendi and the haldi ritual before the wedding ceremony. So though the wedding ceremony is conducted in the synagogue, it's conducted as per the Jewish traditions and rituals. You have a very small malida before that, and you have a mehendi ceremony happening. So this is an image of a mehendi ceremony that took place a few years back, which I had taken a photo of. And you would see an assortment of things. So you'll find a samai over here. You will find a coconut and a thal with uh, rice in it. There is mehendi, and there is a plate with jaggery or good kept in the side. So it's a very traditional. You will find a very strong Indian influences on this particular practice as well. We also have a very small haldi ceremony as well. It's not as elaborate as the mehendi ceremony, but it's still there. Another interesting thing about the Bene Israeli customs is also the practice of singing songs and hymns and the tunes of the Bene Israeli or the prayers that the Bene Israelis have given. So the Bene Israelis sing their prayers and songs in particular tunes that are very unique to the community, and this is something which has evolved over the time period. They have also translated a lot of the songs and hymns from the Torah or the Old Testament into Marathi, so that it reaches a wider Jewish community who may not be very literate. So you have Eliyahu Hanabi's Yanse Geet in Marathi. So it is a song dedicated to Prophet Elijah. And you have the Psalms of King David. So the Testament, the Old Testament or the Torah has Psalms or songs written by King David, and most of these songs have been translated into Marathi, so that the Bene Israeli community who does not speak Hebrew would be able to still understand and enjoy these songs and geet. So this is again a very unique traditional practice of the Bene Israeli community. Um, Finally, we come to the contribution of the Bene Israelis. So, when people look at Bombay, when they look at the Bombay presidency and they look at the Jewish contribution to the city, they understand the Baghdadi Jewish contribution in a very tangible physical form, especially that of the Sassoons and Kaduris and the others. The contribution of the Bene Israeli is far more in the front of education. It's more in the front of medicine and other kind of sectors, especially literature as well. So you have Jerusha Girard, you have Rebecca Rubin, and you have Haim Samuel Kahimkar. You have you have Nassim Ezekiel, and all of these have contributed in different sectors and different professions. So, for example, Jerusha Girard was a gynecologist. She studied in UK, and she was the first woman to be granted scholarship by the Indian government to study abroad. She also contributed heavily for the local Jewish community when she came back. and she worked in a Kama hospital after gaining her degree. Um, she was awarded a title of Padma Shri in 1966. You have Salome Roy, who contributed in the film and entertainment industry. She was a dancer. She is a dancer even today. And you may know her sons, Aditya Roy Kapoor, and the other elder one, which I tend to forget. I'm sorry. But yeah, so she is also Bene Israeli Jew. You have Rebecca Rubin, who was an educator, and she became the first woman to rank first in the matriculation exam of Bombay University. And she specialized in history and Hebrew. She later went on to study abroad in London, and she then studied Hebrew at Cambridge University as well. And then she came back and she started and they started teaching and became a principal in an Bene Israeli school in Bombay, which is the Sir Ali Kaduri High School. Made humongous contribution to the education in Western India and served as on many government boards as well. Um, you have many others. So unfortunately, I couldn't find images of many of these notable people who contributed so much. You have Esther David, who contributed to writing. She's an author, she's a sculptor, she is an art critic, and you have her father Reuben David, who is considered to be the zoo man of India, who started his own zoo in Ahmedabad. And you have many more such prominent and eminent people who made such humongous contributions to not just Bombay and the community, but also on a very large sector. You have Dr. Elijah Moses, who became the mayor of Bombay City, and he was the one who came up, who helped. He was a doctor during the 1920s when Bombay was going through a huge a flu situation, and he treated a lot of people. He participated in a lot of town planning at that point. He realized the importance of proper burial systems in the city to avoid spread of the diseases, and that's why he was also made the mayor of Bombay. So there are humongous contribution and notable contribution. As I mentioned earlier, the Bene Israelis or the Tedis have been contributing in the army since the time of the Marathas and Angrez Navy, and the contribution goes on even today. There are a lot of people who even today are part of the Indian Army as well. So these are some concluding thoughts that Bene Israeli fun is a traditional community, and I use the word traditional because as much as the practices are orthodox, of that of an orthodox Jew, these are passed on from one generation to next as tradition. So the people or the older generation may not know the reasons of why they were practicing a certain thing, but they practiced it because the tradition dictated it to be so. And they're spread across different regions today from Mumbai, Thane, Pune, Ahmedabad, and a few other places, depending on where their jobs and lives took them. The Bene Israeli surnames, food practices, the Malida ceremony, the prayer of Shema, the traditional prayer tunes, these are all part of the Bene Israeli identity. They all give a certain characteristic and a unique identity to the community. Um, as I mentioned earlier, the contribution of the community has been immense in the different professions of medicine, art, education, healthcare, governance, defense, and others. You may not find a lot of physical, tangible evidences of the community, but the contribution has been immense in different other professions and fields. Um, Again, it is today a growing community with its own diasporas around the world. So the community, though may be shrinking in India with hardly 4,500 something living in the country, city or the country, you have a huge Bene Israeli Jewish diaspora settled in Israel, America, Canada, and other places. And this diaspora is now creating their own culture and identity based on where they are settled, and that's how you have the growth and continuation in a culture and cultural practices. So this was it from me today. I hope you guys really liked it.
Thank you so much, Leora. That was so enlightening. You took us across religion, culture, food, practices, whatnot. The last thing you mentioned a number about 4,500 people. Is that in Bombay or is that all over India?
I think this is a number which is all over India and may also
Okay.
include some other Jews as well.
Okay.
We have not been able to put a right census on the Beni Israelis per se as of now.
So, is there any census do the Jews get counted during the census in India, or are they clubbed under others?
So for the very long time, we were clubbed under the minorities or others, basically others. But in Maharashtra, I think around 2015, 2012, we received a minority status. So the Jews in Maharashtra received a minority status and are now considered under minority.
Okay. So you've told us about the numbers in India. What would be the total number if you did a global count? What would be the community
Um,
members around the world?
so there are about, at least for my, as far I know, at least 50 to 60,000 Bene Israelis in Israel.
Okay.
And you can count around 5 to 10,000 in US and Canada as well.
Okay. So let's start at the beginning now.
Yeah.
Which is the most commonly ascribed to theory about the date of the arrival? You mentioned four scenarios.
Mhm.
Which would be the most widely accepted date?
It's so the widely accepted date is somewhere in the second century BC. So
Okay.
believe that they came before the second temple because they didn't practice Hanukkah as I mentioned. So that
Okay.
is a widely accepted understanding in theory.
So Dr. Kelkar's question is about the Naggaon cemetery. Has there been any attempt to carbon date, DNA sequence any of the remains to get a fix on the number on the period?
So very recently, someone has been trying to work on these cemeteries and trying to document. There has not been an attempt at carbon dating as of now. As far as what my information says, it's not been carbon dated, but
Okay.
someone has been working on it. Maybe I think there are a lack of fundings or whatever.
Okay.
Hmm.
Question from Mr. Naik. Which lost tribe do the Bene Israelis belong to? Would it be correct to say
Um,
that they belong to the tribes of Zebulon and Asher?
See, again, I'm not very sure because, again, see, we came in different time period. There are different conjectures and theory. There are different claims and understandings. So I won't be able to actually put down because we have always called ourselves Bene Israeli, but we have not adhered to a particular tribe saying that this is the tribe that we belong to. So
Okay.
I won't be able to answer that question, right?
So, do the Bene Israelis have linkages with the other Jewish communities in India, like the Sephardic and the even the Jews of Mizoram? Do they connect with each other? Do they worship? Is there commonality in their worship?
So interestingly, a lot of Mizoram Jews over the years have been in touch with the Bene Israelis in Bombay.
Hmm.
And there is an organization that works with the Jews in the country called as the AJDC. It's an American funded organization.
Yes.
So under this organization, a lot of Mizoram Jews have been given an opportunity to come to Bombay to study, to explore the culture, to learn more about Judaism, and explore their own religion as well. So they do attend prayers with us during some festivals if they are here in the city. We do interact with them. So yes, there is an open linkage with them. Same with the Baghdadi Jews as well. So the Baghdadi Jews are not many in number today, but there are Baghdadi synagogues, and those synagogues require people to come and worship. So the Bene Israelis do attend prayers and Shabbat prayers in these Baghdadi synagogues as well.
And vice versa?
Not so much because there are not many of them.
Okay. Okay. Um, I also belong to a community which traces its origin to a similar story to the one which you just described about coming to the western coast of India. So, and the question which I'm going to ask you is being asked by a naval person. He says
Okay.
if the Bene Israeli was fleeing India to escape religious persecution, would it also be likely that there were already Jews present on the western coast? Because according to this naval person, Commander Mohan Narayan, you don't just flee, you don't just sit in a boat and go to an
True.
unknown destination. So was there a presence of Jews anyway before these shipwrecked couples?
He's very right that you just don't flee and go to an uncharted land. What you have is not a record of Jews settled in India, but but Jews having trade relations with Southport. So
Hmm.
with Muziris and Calicut, and you have a trade relation.
Yes.
And this trade relation somewhere is some theories go back says that it goes back as far as the time of King Solomon. So when you have that kind of a trade relation and you knew that there is a land somewhere where you can escape persecution, there is a theory that says that they were not headed to the western coast, as in not Naugao per se, but they were headed down south. It was only because a ship wrecked on that coast that they ended up in Naugao. And they also believe that the Cochin Jews that you have down south is basically the ship that successfully reached the shore down there.
Okay, so what I'm trying to do, Leora, is I'm trying to find commonalities between what you described and the other boat people, the Zoroastrians. You
Mhm.
mentioned that the Bene Israelis did not have any contact with the Holy Land, and somebody came and told them about their heritage, etc. What is there any evidence of any communication, any visits from the Holy Land to here and here to the Holy Land before this community was discovered, so to speak?
So there are no records of this community leaving and going in search of the other communities, other Jewish diaspora. There are no records, but there are believed to be records of some people trying and coming. But this is after the discovery of sea route and so on and so forth. When you have the Portuguese, you have, for example, Garcia de Orta and all coming, and then they are trying to have a communication with the local Jews, but before that, it's unlikely there are any records per se.
You talked a lot about surnames amongst the community. The question from Victor was, what are the common first names amongst the Bene Israel? Are they Jewish or are they Marathi?
So the interestingly, the earlier, if you look at the earlier generations, like 4 to 5 generations back, your first names would be quite Marathi. So I know for sure that my great grandfather was Bapuji Pezarkar. And you have, for example, Samuel Divekar is basically referred to as Samaji Isaji Divekar. So you have these old names, and you had a suffix of Bai or Ben on them. So Miriam Bai, you have those kind of suffixes for women as well. So yeah.
Yeah, and you said there were a lot of Marathi customs, words, etc., which were incorporated by the community. Did any Yiddish words flow into Marathi, according to you?
Interesting. So I'm not very sure about the Yiddish words. I'll have to think. No one asked me this before. Not that I can
Parvez,
think of immediately.
okay. Parvez, you can pat yourself on the back. We talked about Masjid Bandar. You explained about it being the first synagogue in the city, etc. But is there any documented evidence where Masjid Bandar area gets its name from? Because there is a Sattar Masjid which is very close by, which is very old. So are we certain, or is it a theory, that Masjid Bandar takes its name from the synagogue and not from the mosque?
No, it's properly recorded that the Masjid Bandar takes its names from the synagogue.
Okay,
There are a lot of books and records that do mention it.
okay, okay. So Vinayak, that answers your question. I would like to take on the next one. Commander again asks, is there a quorum required for religious services in a synagogue?
Yes, there is a requirement of 10 men above the age of 13
Yes.
to complete a quorum.
And the next two questions are about food. Is halal chicken kosher, and where can one get a good Beni Israeli meal?
So technically, if you look at halal, it can be kosher, but it's only in the technicality and science of it. As a religious practice, halal and kosher are two different things, because the person cutting the chicken or making it kosher has to be an observant Jew. He has to recite a particular prayer, and then he cuts the meat. So if you look at those aspects, it's kosher is different from halal. But if you look at the science of it, or
Okay.
the technique, it may be the same.
Okay.
As for the Bene Israeli meal, in where you can get a Bene Israeli meal, there are no Bene Israeli restaurants per se, but there are some catering services, or if you know a Bene Israeli family, you can always ask them to prepare some interesting meals for you.
Um, until the Bene Israelis of the Western Coast were introduced to their origins and their culture, there would not have been any synagogues, right? So would they have worshipped at local temples?
No, so there are no records of them worshipping temples. What we
Okay.
have is that because there were no synagogues and because the temple, they didn't know about the temples or anything. A lot of them have records of them worshipping from their own homes. So that's where somewhere I believe these practices of Malida and Thal Bharne come up, because you need something, so you are making an offering, but you don't have idol worship. You don't do idol worship.
Mm-hmm.
So this is something that comes up. So for example, there is a record in Himkar's book which
Mm-hmm.
talks about Yom Kippur, a very important Jewish festival being referred to as Dar Faritza Son. And it's basically it says Dar Faritza Son because on that particular day, the Jews or the Beni Israelis shut their doors of their houses and they settle in their and they sit in their home and they pray in their home. So they don't go out or they step out or anything. So this is so that is the record that we have. So they don't visit any temples or anything.
Okay. And so, which brings us to a related question from Sonal. What is the etymology of the word synagogue?
Synagogue is a common universal term. I'll have to check what's the etymology, which language it particularly comes
Okay.
from, if it's Hebrew or not.
I'm going to request you to open your presentation because there's a specific question about one of the images in one of the very early portions of your presentation. There
Okay.
was a picture of food and there was a plant next to it. You mentioned the plant,
Yeah.
but somebody wanted to know what was the name of the plant and what is its significance.
It's a basically sabja plant. You get it across if you ask any of these local vendors.
Okay,
It's like your basil. It has a particular fragrance.
okay.
Mhm.
And there was another image that you showed about, it was an extract from a Marathi book with images of women who were making the flatbread. And
Hmm.
there were images of men.
Hmm.
So the question from Kaiwan was, are those the headgear which the men were wearing, was that borrowed from local Marathi people?
So there is a Jewish practice of having an headgear for the men. So it's called a kippah.
Yeah.
It's a very small headgear today, but if you look at the traditional or the rabbinical communities or the Iddish and those, they wear a very big black top hat and things like that. So it's a very Jewish thing. They might have taken certain influences, but otherwise, no.
Okay. The question from Manaswini, did the Second World War have any effect on the Bene Israelis in India?
Uh, I'm not. The Bene Israelis did participate. Some of them did participate in the wars. I'm not sure if it was the Second World War per se, but they did have a participation in the wars. In this time, there is in fact a Haifa memorial in Israel, commemorating the contribution of the Bene Israelis in the war. So I'll have to check which war is it particularly about.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Mm.
Uh, and do the Bene Israelis intermarry now?
Intermarry as in within the different communities or different religions.
Yes, different communities, different religions. I mean,
So,
do they marry only Jews? And the next question is, do they marry outside the Jewish community?
so that they can. So usually they look at people who are from the Bene Israeli community because then you share the same cultural aspects. If you're looking for a marrying in a Jew, a lot of people who are settled in Israel do look at other Jewish diaspora as well. As for intermarriages, it is over the years now becoming slightly common because of lack of eligible bachelors in the community, and also exposure to obviously the different communities around. Interestingly, I'll just like to add that if you look at the laws of Judaism and if you look at who is a Jew, you would understand that only a person whose mother is a Jew is considered to be a Jew. So that way, the
Yes,
community is very matrilineal in its approach. So the father could be a non-Jew, and the child would still be considered a Jew if the mother is a Jewish.
yes.
Mhm.
So that's one of the key differences between your community and mine, which is also equally microscopic about the matrilineal aspect of it following the religion. So I guess your response is an answer for both Parvez as well as Dr. Ravindra Kaur. Parimala says that she's heard that there is some Jewish origin to the Konkanasta Brahmin community of Maharashtra. There is some Jewish origin to the Konkanasta Brahmin community.
I have heard about theories around Chitpavan Brahmins.
Okay.
Coconuts, not very sure. They could have some theory around it as well. But Chitpavan definitely has it that they also have the same story of being landed because of a shipwreck. And I think it's related to them being revived on the shore.
Mm, mm,
They have similar stories. So there are theories around that. Definitely I've heard of those. But again, you can't prove anything. It's very difficult today to prove such theories to be
yes.
true.
Yes. Priya is asking, what is the Bene Israeli experience of engaging with Israelis back from the Holy Land as tourists there or when they choose to emigrate? Are they positive experiences? Are they not so positive experiences?
So when they move from here to Israel, is
As
that where what?
tourists or when they choose to immigrate?
Okay. So there are so interestingly, if you look at in the earlier timeline, if you look at 1950s when the first wave of migration started, 1950s, 60s, they did face a lot of problem with discrimination because they were brown Jews, and a lot of them even chose to come back to India because they were not very happy with the situation back there. As far as tourists, you don't face so much of a problem because you're just like any other tourist in that place. Israel is a very global place today, and Jews have benefit anywhere in the world, including the Bene Israelis, of receiving a 10-year tourist visa. So we don't face much of a problem. But yeah, some might face personally. If someone might face, then it's a very personal thing to happen. Might happen anywhere in the world.
Okay, the next question takes us to the very basic premise of this lecture. Victor wants to know if the Jews don't work on Saturdays due to the Shabbat, why call them Shanivar Telis?
So this is to basically identify कि इनके घर पे शनिवार को नहीं जाना है.
काम नहीं करना है.
हाँ.
Yeah, true. And the last comment is from Commander Mohan Nara, and this is, I guess, in response to the question about World War II. He mentions that the Haifa Memorial is for three Indian cavalry regiments that liberated Haifa in the First World War. And he also adds that there are two outstanding Bene Israeli community members who served in the Indian Armed Forces, and they were Lieutenant General Jacob and Vice Admiral Sampson.
Yes.
Well, I think we have come to the end of our talk. Thank you so much. It's been really interesting to learn so much about a community which has contributed quite a lot. Such little is known, and you've taken us across so many centuries to give us this fascinating preview. Thank you,
Thank you for
everyone.
the opportunity.